Hi, this is Sunil Bharti, and welcome to another episode of TFiR Insights. StackRox has released its State of Container and Kubernetes Security Report. They do it, I think, more than twice a year. And this report is significant from a lot of perspective. Kubernetes is growing and it's creating a new challenges for security and for developers. So to discuss not only just this report, but what we learned from it and how we can bring those things into practice, we have with us once again, Michelle McLean, VP of Marketing at StackRox. Michelle, it's good to have you back on the show.
Swapnil, it's great to be with you again. Thank you so much.
I want to hear from your perspective, what were the most interesting findings from this survey?
So, a lot of findings were really a continuation of what we've seen before. We continue to see that customers are concerned about the security aspects of their container and Kubernetes strategy. We see that reflected in a few dimensions. If you ask them which part of the strategy are you most worried about, security, compliance concerns will be at the top of the list. One really important question, if you ask, have you needed to delay a rollout of an application into production because of security concerns? You get a really high degree, 44%, saying yes, they've delayed a rollout. And if you think about why we're doing cloud native technology, we're doing it for better agility, better flexibility, better speed. And so to see security continue to be a prominent enough issue that they're actually slowing down application rollout because of security, that's a significant finding, and it should give everybody pause about what you need to do to prepare on the security front so that your application solutions can roll out on time. I think the counter to that is that we also asked how many of you guys are embarking on DevSecOps initiatives. Do you have collaboration between the DevOps team and the security team? We were entirely delighted to see a really high percentage, 83% of respondents said, yes, we're doing some form of DevSecOps. And we kind of posed the question along a continuum. We have a little bit of collaboration between DevOps teams and security teams. We have some security automation and some security tooling in place, and we're using joint policies that we've collaborated on together, and we're flowing into these existing DevOps workflows. And then sort of furthest down the continuum, we're integrating and automating security entirely across the SDLC. So, and along that spectrum, there was still a really good mix. 40% said, they're just getting going on the collaboration, but 43% were at one of those further stages, that they have automation in place, that they're doing security as code. So very positive finding. So they're moving towards the kind of nirvana that we all want to get to, which is that we have security embedded across the app dev lifecycle. But there's still clearly people are still hitting some hiccups.
Right. Also, that was actually kind of worrying that they had to delay the release because of security. If you look at your previous report, which I think came out early this year, was there any really major change that you saw? Hey, this is a major change that we're noticing in this survey versus what we did the previous survey?
We saw a couple of interesting changes. Nothing really huge. That's the interesting thing is, more apps in that are getting containerized, more of my containers in Kube in production. Those continue to just build on each other, and even the use of Kube itself. Right? We had, I think, when we started the survey about 3 years ago, it was about 57% penetration, went up to about 72% penetration, and this time it hit 90% penetration. So big picture stuff isn't changing much. One interesting thing, it changed only subtly, so you can't read too much into it, but across hundreds of respondents, it's interesting to see this shift. Vulnerability management and visibility have consistently topped the use. When you top the list, when you ask people which use cases are you most focused on, which use cases do you think are must-have, critical to your deployment versus nice to have. For the first time ever in this edition of the survey results, we found that compliance and runtime detection took the number 1 and number 2 spots respectively. And what's interesting to me about that is that it's, I think, part and parcel of some of the maturation that we're seeing when we ask people how much is in prod and things like that. We're seeing those numbers tick up. And I think this change in use cases, what I'm hoping it means, because we don't ask these kinds of anecdotal information, but what I'm hoping it means is that some of the basics around, like, do I even know what's going on from a visibility standpoint, or do I feel like I've satisfied the needs on the vuln side? I'm hoping that those are reflecting a little lower on the list because people feel like they've got some baseline capabilities in place there. So if you think about compliance and runtime detection, that's when you're further along in your deployment and you really need to make sure you have those extra protections in place. So the being reflective of a more mature deployment, that's a really interesting finding this year.
Right. And as you said that Kubernetes penetration is increasing like almost 70 to 90%, if I'm not wrong, if I heard you correctly. I mean, today everybody is using Kubernetes. I don't know who is not using it. From your perspective, as we were talking about earlier, that the whole idea of DevSecOps is that you should not have to delay anything. What role is adoption of Kubernetes playing in making these users embrace DevSecOps as well? So basically, what impact is Kubernetes having on the way they develop and deploy their application?
What we're seeing is that it's really, when they get past the initial learning curve, right? They've got to get through this learning curve. It's a complicated technology, but as they move up that learning curve, they can really start to delve into the security capabilities that are in Kubernetes that come with, it's not strictly speaking just Kubernetes, right? It's the whole move to declarative, immutable infrastructure. That has a tremendous amount of potential on the security landscape. And I think what's really positive about this is that people, as they get more comfortable with Kubernetes as the control plane for infrastructure, they can really begin to embrace it as the control plane for security. And I think that holds a lot of promise. And I think it's helping chart a path toward DevSecOps, right? Towards better integration amongst development teams, operations teams, security teams, regardless of how you're organized, right? It doesn't matter if you're literally embedding these groups together. If you are weaving together these disciplines and having these functional roles work together much earlier in the cycle and then all through the app dev life cycle, I think that is what it takes to get into really moving as DevSecOps, really getting security embedded in the infrastructure, policies embedded as code. And so that trend and the adoption that we're seeing on that front is very, very promising because this is how we will unlock the ultimate potential of this cloud native stack.
If you look at Kubernetes, it's a very complicated piece of technology. There are so many knobs to be turned. And, it's not just you get one solution is done. There are different, if you look at CNCF landscape, there are so many different tools that you have to use. What kind of trends are you seeing there in terms of, Kubernetes is meant to be an orchestrator, but you have to use so many things along with it. So how are people effectively managing it? And also, everybody is doing multi-cloud. So what about different cloud architectures there?
So to your question about multi-cloud, that's one of the interesting subtleties that we found here. And we see this in a few areas. We see this in questions around multi-cloud. We also see it in some of the questions around what new technologies are you adopting. So I'll touch on two of these findings. For multi-cloud, we ask them, how are you deploying? Only on-prem or prem in one cloud or prem in multi-cloud. So we ask it in a way you can only answer one of these. And what we're finding is that while there's a lot of talk about multi-cloud, and you hear a lot of executives talk about the desire to have portability across cloud environments, we're not actually seeing that being adopted as much. We saw that more than half of the respondents are running their deployments in a single cloud, and only 34% are running in multi-cloud. And, I've heard a few people talk about it, that it's one of the more aspirational aspects of Kubernetes that you would run multi-cloud. And anecdotally, I can share that we have customers who will say, well, we started in this platform, but then our customers really wanted us to be in that platform. And so, we needed to migrate our service there to support that one as well. So it's complicated to run in a multi-cloud environment. We have one customer, Mux, which is in the arena of video production, and they have to have their content be as close as possible to their customers. So they've been multi-cloud from the beginning. And the interesting thing about that is Kubernetes is that universal layer. It really does enable that multi-cloud deployment for them. And they needed security policies that did the same thing. They needed it to be really consistent, whether they were on AWS or Azure or Google. And so, that Kubernetes plus StackRox gave them that universality, gave them that portability. But they needed to do that for latency reasons for serving up video content. A lot of our customers that we're seeing, they're in a single cloud. The other area that I would point out is something like OPA. There's been a lot of press coverage about OPA as an upcoming technology and who's going to be using it. And when we asked about some next generation cloud native technologies that are in use, we asked about functions, we asked about service mesh, and we asked about OPA. OPA actually came in with just 3% of people saying that they were using it in production. So amongst the lowest, and yet it's talked about hugely. So it's one of those areas where we will definitely keep an eye on this. Is the hype outpacing the usefulness or the adoption, at least, of this technology? And it would appear for a couple of things it slightly is.
Perfect. Since you mentioned video, and I was like, I remember Netflix and all those companies, they also have, local, they have a cache local to my area, so that and they're using a lot of AI ML also to make sure that content is available locally, so there is no latency. Sometimes these technologies, these use cases actually drive a lot of new way companies are using and leveraging these technologies, which I don't think that, when we create new technology, we don't even think about these use cases. And suddenly people come there and start using in a way that is actually exciting, which actually leads me to the next question. Though it's hard to kind of predict, but it's still, since you have been in this industry for so long, I want to hear that, what do you think that, how do you think Kubernetes will continue to evolve? You mentioned, increasing interest in OPA and all those technologies. From this report and the trend you're seeing in this space, can you talk about it?
Yeah, I think there's a few things to keep an eye on. And I'll blend sort of what's in the survey findings over time and then what we hear when we're talking to our customers. So one of the aspects that I hear a fair bit is how they want to deploy. And using a managed service is very, very popular. We saw an uptick in this most recent survey of people doing self-managed Kubernetes. And what I suspect is that you see a little bit of an ebb and flow. So when you're first starting and you're doing stuff at small scale, and maybe it's not, fully associated with a production app yet or things like that, you tend to be tinkering likely on-prem, and likely you're managing it yourself because you're getting familiar with the technology. But we see a big push to manage services. Clearly a lot of the advisory services, such as Gartner, recommend using managed services. It just takes a big burden off. But I hear a lot of people, both at the CISO level and at the INO level, infrastructure and ops level, talking about the desire to offload, right? I want to minimize what I'm asking my staff to do. That's why we chose a managed service. It's just one less thing on their plate. So I expect over time that self-managed will continue to drop. Now, we ask that in concert with, it's not an all or nothing. When we ask it, we ask, pick all that apply. And so right behind self-managed was, AWS EKS. Right. So I think self-managed was at 50% and EKS was at 44%. So right in there, neck and neck, and likely you could be doing a mixture. Over time, I think the lion's share, it's already stated that EKS runs more Kubernetes workloads in the world than anything else. So I think you'll see that continue. It just makes a lot of sense to reduce a not very useful part. It's not like you're going to differentiate your business on how you run the control plane for Kubernetes, right? So using a managed service makes a lot of sense. I think the other thing to really keep an eye on is multi-cloud and hybrid. So we expect hybrid will continue to increase, right? It's at 44% today. I expect that will continue to go up. There are a number of companies that are sorting through which workloads to run where. And I've had some customers give voice to, there's certain things where if it's not a flexing model, or as certain levels of consumption really dramatically grow, cost in the cloud goes up a lot. And one way to mitigate that is to look at, are there workloads that have a lot of ingress, egress, or that don't flex a lot? Where are you better off having some of that on-prem? I can think of the company Zoom. They've given voice to the fact that they were mostly in colo, really blew up with COVID, needed to adopt cloud to move fast, but it's costly. And that could be one area where companies can really make use of that hybrid strategy to do a little bit more of the economic modeling behind all of this.
When we talk about security, what I often hear this is not my problem, it's someone else's problem, but things are changing, So from the perspective of this report, have you seen any change, like when we talk about DevSecOps, that no, it's not someone else's responsible, it's developers' responsible as well. So talk a bit about where is the buck stopping these days?
Yes, that is a great question. And we ask that every time. We offer a few different examples of roles, but we say who in your organization is responsible for container and Kubernetes security. And we have, security, DevOps, Ops, DevSecOps, looking to see whether that grows, and then developers. And security continues to decline, which is really interesting. And what I hope this gets at is that it's becoming a more blended exercise. There's definitely the notion that everybody's responsible for security. The lowest responses is when if they identify developer. It's only 10% of respondents say developers are ultimately responsible. As a single category, security is the largest at 29%. But if you look at this blended role, if you look at DevOps, Ops, and DevSecOps, collectively, that's coming in at 60%. And so that is lion's share of the responsibilities, straddles those kinds of operational roles blended into development and security. And I think that we will continue to see that climb, and we'll see more organizations have, the emerging role designated of DevSecOps.
Michelle, thank you so much for once again taking your time out and talking about this report. And I look forward to talk to you again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Swapnil. Always a pleasure to be with you.